Hey there, Icarus here. You might be wondering what I'm doing in possession of this pleasingly round CRT television. Well, truth be told, I had this burning desire to go and experience Doom for the PlayStation on not just original hardware, but also through period-appropriate CRT television technology. Now, the period-appropriate part is probably a bit of a wide bracket here, because this television, the Philips Discoverer, was actually released in 1983, over a decade before the release of the PlayStation itself. In fact, this television was designed to commemorate the first space shuttle launch by NASA in 1981. Oh, and yes, just for reference, the visor does indeed come down over the screen. You can still play stuff through it, but personally speaking, I prefer it with the helmet off. As a result, the inputs on this are relatively sparse. There are no component cable inputs here. In fact, all you're going to get is an RF aerial input. That's it. Thankfully, that's what the PlayStation here uses. You just pop it in the back, tune the television to whatever UHF band that the PlayStation's running on, and boom! Classic PlayStation gaming for all to enjoy. Now, I will have to apologize for any visual artifacting on the CRT here. This is largely because I've never really had to film a CRT television, and this is, of course, running in PAL format, which means it operates at 50 Hz, not 60. It's a bit of an unusual thing to get the shutter speed working for, and all I've really got to record here is my phone. So after a bit of tinkering, a bit of figuring out what program isn't going to rip me off just so I can edit the shutter settings, this is the best I could do. But yes, Doom for the Sony PlayStation. A package that actually included not just Doom, but also Doom 2. It eschews the usual episodic format for the original Doom, however, instead choosing to present them as a single unbroken run. So you don't get the choice between starting at Knee Deep in the Dead, Shores of Hell, or Inferno. You just have to power through that thing. Or find the password codes, because this did not actually support memory card save slots. The passwords were actually a fascinating workaround for the lack of memory card support, because rather than just keeping track of what level you've reached, they also kept track of a few other vital stats, such as your difficulty level, your health, your armor, your ammunition, all tracked upon the start of whatever level you'd reached. So conceivably, before you power down your PlayStation, or if you're unfortunately hit with a power cut, provided you'd noted down the password on good old-fashioned pen and paper somewhere, you could pick up pretty much where you left off. Naturally, this is a port that faced a lot of challenges. Back in the day, porting from PC to console and vice versa was not an inconsiderable job, and this is largely thanks to the fact that the architecture between many of these devices was often very different. For example, some of the major challenges that this project faced, according to programmer Aaron Seeler, is the fact that the PlayStation didn't natively support perspective-correct texture mapping. So that was definitely something they needed to figure out. Not to mention the other challenge, which is, of course, making the game run at an acceptable frame rate. Yeah, we've come a long way since those days, considering we can get Doom running on a friggin' pregnancy test. Now, as you might imagine, this port was not a one-to-one deal. It was not a perfect translation of PC to console. In fact, the PlayStation version of Doom took a lot of its cues from the Jaguar port of Doom, at least in regards to stuff such as the gameplay texture and map changes that featured in that particular port. And that's very apparent when you're playing through these. The levels are widened, there's more space to maneuver, and that almost certainly feels like a concession for the control method via the PlayStation gamepad. It's got strafing via L1, L2. You can turn left and right, go forwards and backwards with the D-pad. It's just that it's a little spongy in terms of responsiveness, so yeah, that extra maneuvering room is greatly appreciated. Visually, there's a bit of a sparseness to the PlayStation version of Doom, what with it playing in the same texture pool as the Jaguar version. Obviously, this will save on memory usage. You got a reduced texture pool, it's not going to have to do as much work, but this does mean that you're going to miss out on a few familiar things that you might expect from the original version of Doom, like environmental sprites. Sure, you got nukage barrels here and there, but you're going to be missing out on some of the more benign objects, such as the floor lamps, for example. Another interesting omission is mid-textures. In the ending section of E1M1, you may notice that those traditional mid-textures aren't there, instead replaced with sector windows where you've just lowered the ceiling and raised the floor, and that gap between functions just fine. In other levels, there's a fascinating workaround for it, where instead of having a dedicated mid-texture sprite that you can see through, they've just taken a pre-existing wall sprite and made it transparent. Mercifully though, PlayStation Doom makes this more sparse-feeling environment work to its advantage. And that is thanks to a drastic change in terms of soundtrack, and of course use of more dramatic colored lighting in various sectors of each level. On the former front, the soundtrack is fascinating. When given the choice to reuse the Bobby Prince soundtrack, Williams Entertainment seemed to get cold feet from the concept of having to pay royalties as a result of that, and instead said, you know what, we'll make our own soundtrack with hookers and blackjack. In fact, let's just get Aubrey Hodges. And so they got Aubrey Hodges, and he delivered a very different feeling sonic soundscape for PlayStation Doom, one that reflected the sparse gloominess of its visuals, and delivered a sense of atmosphere that would go on to color the entire atmospheric stylings of Doom 64 further on down the line. In fact, you can easily consider PlayStation Doom as the effective testbed for what would eventually become Doom 64. The main menu theme here gets reused for Doom 64, a lot of the sound effects get carried over, and of course the visual stylings carry over as well. Those dramatic colored sector lights very much form the basis for what will become that Doom 64 visual style. Now, throughout the course of the gameplay that's featured here, you may have noticed a few things are amiss. Certain enemies turning up that you normally wouldn't expect to see, maybe the acquisition of weapons slightly earlier than usual, and that's because I am playing this on ultraviolence. Now, a lot of the changes make more sense when you realize that they pretty much stripped out Nightmare difficulty from PlayStation Doom. It was always regarded as unbalanced, and they just thought, you know what, let's do something interesting with ultraviolence instead. And that involved bringing enemies that normally wouldn't have appeared in the original Doom at all into much earlier levels. Hence the appearance of a pain elemental in E1M1 and, chain gunners. But hey, silver lining. Earlier access to the chain gun. Can't argue with that. You know what else is a silver lining? There's no archviles in PlayStation Doom. Not a single one. Apparently the developers thought that they weren't able to quite do the enemy type justice on PlayStation, so made the executive decision to omit the enemy entirely. Another omission that may surprise you is that this doesn't feature an icon of Sin battle at the end of the Doom 2 run of levels. I know, right? Instead, you get another Spider Mastermind fight, and as much as I would have loved to have shown you that using this hardware here, unfortunately I only had a very narrow window of time to get this entire setup working properly. But yeah, there's also a few levels missing from both the OG Doom as well as Doom 2, but that sting is soothed somewhat with the inclusion of a few PlayStation exclusive levels, not to mention that the run of Ultimate Doom that's part of this PlayStation disc includes Episode 4, Thy Flesh Consumed. But overall, playing through PlayStation Doom is a fascinating time capsule, and one that delivered a pleasing degree of nostalgia into my brain. Just the entire process, putting in a disc, loading up the PlayStation, seeing it display on that crispy CRT television screen that I'll freely admit has seen better days, but yeah, still does the job just fine. Now, would I recommend playing through PlayStation Doom on original hardware as an essential experience that you must absolutely have as a fan of the Doom series? No, not especially. Not unless you're a diehard or have a fair degree of nostalgia attached to both the console and this particular version of the game. But yeah, I'll freely admit it's fascinating being able to see that connective tissue that leads from PlayStation Doom into Doom 64, which, you know what? I'd probably recommend more. It's certainly much more accessible, what with having that spiffy Night Dive remaster, and is all the more worthwhile in my opinion thanks to the fact that it's not retreading old ground, instead forging forward with fresh levels and much more interesting visuals. But in any case, I hope you've enjoyed this impromptu, unorthodox history lesson on PlayStation Doom. I genuinely just felt the burning need to own it physically and play it on original hardware, and everything just coalesced into this wonderful little opportunity that I'm happy to share with you guys. If you're a fan of this, I am open to the possibility of doing more videos of this type in the future. I feel like I've officially been bitten by the CRT display bug, and I feel like it would be a fun way to spitball not just about the hardware, but about the other games that I enjoyed back in the PlayStation era and beyond. Who knows? The only limit is my dwindling funds. So yes, if you'd like to help support these shenanigans, I've got Patreon, I've got channel memberships. That'll grant you early access, the occasional extended video, maybe an exclusive where I cook some questionable British food for your viewing pleasure. And ultimately will help keep this channel going and keep me making irresponsible eBay purchases. But until next time, this has been Mr. Icarus. Thank you very much for watching. Icarus out.